On 22nd August 1485, two women unexpectedly inherited the responsibility of the House of York: Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of King Edward IV, and his sister, Margaret of Burgundy. Neither had ever been intended for such a role. Henry Tudor had just triumphed over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, where the third and final Yorkist king fell in combat. With him, all the remaining Yorkist male heirs had lost. For Elizabeth and Margaret, however, the situation was different. Tudor had sworn to make Elizabeth his queen, and he would keep that oath. Meanwhile, Margaret, the sister of Edward and Richard, remained beyond his reach in Burgundy. Welcome back to Lemmy History. In a three-part series, I will explore the struggle between Elizabeth and Margaret for dominance over the House of York, and by extension, for England itself. Each episode is structured so that you can follow along without needing to watch the others. But of course, I'd love for you to watch all three. This is episode 1. Today we will examine the road to Bosworth, focusing on Elizabeth and Richard. During this time, Margaret remained on the sidelines, and by the end of this video, we will uncover the reasons why. We will also explore why Elizabeth and her sisters were overlooked by their aunt when she sought out defeated Yorkists, and how a man who had been dead for years may have played a crucial role in these events. But first things first. The relationship between Elizabeth of York and Richard III is often depicted today in an overly romanticized way. Many claim that an affair took place between the king and his niece. Some even argue that Richard intended to marry her, citing his public declaration of 31st March 1485. A letter, which historian George Buck claimed to have seen in the first half of the 17th century, is frequently used as evidence that Elizabeth was passionately in love with her uncle. One of its most striking lines states that Elizabeth belonged to Richard in heart and in thoughts, in body and in all. However, this phrase appears in the largely forged Buck edition of 1646. In the original 1619 version, at least the words "in body" are absent. While the later version suggests a physical affair, the original text makes this interpretation far less certain. We will explore this in greater detail later. Nevertheless, authors such as Alison Weir have relied on this now-lost letter to paint Elizabeth as a love-struck young woman eagerly awaiting the death of Queen Anne Neville so she could be united with Richard. The letter was allegedly addressed to John Howard, who was meant to speak to Richard on Elizabeth's behalf. This reading gains traction from the Croyland Chronicle, which reports that even Richard's closest advisors, William Catesby and Richard Ratcliffe, believed the king wished to marry his niece. Even within Ricardian circles, this idea has gained significant traction. Richard's most eloquent defender, Paul Murray Kendall, speculates that Richard may have briefly considered Elizabeth as a possible wife, out of desperation and longing for an heir. According to Kendall, an unreliable council member leaked this information, and Polydore Virgil even names him Lord Chancellor Thomas Rotherham. Rotherham's involvement is intriguing and reflects a pattern we will encounter repeatedly. Initially, in 1483, after Edward IV's death, Rotherham sided with the Woodvilles. He supported the plan to sideline Richard, then Duke of Gloucester, and even handed over the Great Seal to Elizabeth Woodville while she and her children sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. However, on the 13th of May, 1483, under immense pressure from Richard, he surrendered it to John Russell. A month later, Richard had him arrested and briefly imprisoned, believing he was conspiring against him alongside William Hastings. Strikingly, Richard reinstated Rotherham as Lord Chancellor 2 years later, likely as a gesture of reconciliation. The assumption behind Rotherham's supposed leak about Richard's wedding plans is that he remained loyal to the Woodvilles. At court, the most prominent Woodville figure was Elizabeth herself, the very person at the heart of the marriage speculation. It is easy to imagine that Rotherham informed her, and that she, in turn, spread the news to sabotage the plan. According to Virgil, she firmly opposed such a marriage. The persistence of this marriage rumor is largely due to the enduring image of Elizabeth as a lovesick young woman, as well as the influence of Tudor propaganda, which positioned her as an enemy of Richard. In order to sustain this exaggerated narrative, later writers resorted to outright fabrications. One of the most infamous sources is the Most Pleasant Song of Lady Bessie, written by Humphrey Brereton, a servant of Thomas Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's husband. One particularly well-known stanza, which I have modernized for clarity, describes Elizabeth confronting Richard's corpse after the Battle of Bosworth. They struck his helmet until it crushed into his head, until the brain came out with blood. They didn't stop until he was dead. Then they carried him to Leicester and dragged his head beneath his feet. Bessie met him with a cheerful smile and greeted him with these words, "How do you feel about the killing of my dear brothers?" Clearly, this is pure fiction. In reality, Elizabeth was 160 kilometers away at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire when Richard was killed. Historian Amy Licence, in her biography of Elizabeth of York, comments, "The ballad employs characters as fictional devices, using poetic license rather than seeking to record the veracity of events. Elizabeth's portrayal is spirited but misleading. When combined with the supposed letter to Howard, this ballad can easily be dismissed as Tudor propaganda, along with the claim that Elizabeth was Richard's enemy. Brereton also claimed to have smuggled letters between Elizabeth and Henry Tudor while he was in exile in Brittany, yet this too is widely regarded as a fabrication and is largely ignored by historians. Thus emerged the romanticized image of Elizabeth of York as the Queen of Hearts, supposedly deeply in love with her husband Henry Tudor, who in turn loved her. Some even claim that she inspired the depiction of the Queen of Hearts in a standard deck of playing cards. In a broader sense, this interpretation reflects another popular narrative, Elizabeth as a mere pawn in the political machinations of men. Some portray her as a helpless hostage of the Tudors, stripped of any true authority by her evil mother-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, and reduced to nothing more than a vessel for producing heirs, a role that ultimately led to her death. This same narrative suggests that the Tudors banished her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, to a convent, where she died in loneliness and neglect. Yet, this disregards the fact that Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort had known each other for decades and shared a friendly relationship. Narratives shape historical interpretation, and this is not inherently problematic. However, when it comes to women, these narratives often take precedence over actual evidence. In recent years, historians have made increasing efforts to correct misconceptions about Elizabeth of York, especially regarding her relationship with Richard. The key clue regarding Elizabeth's letter to Howard actually dates back to the 19th century. At that time, historian James Gairdner noted that Edward IV had sent Howard to France to negotiate an engagement between his eldest daughter and the Dauphin. This alliance had been under discussion since Elizabeth was a toddler, and she was referred to as the Dauphine of France until December 1482, when the arrangement ultimately fell apart. Charles married Maximilian's daughter instead. This raises the question, could the letter have originated from this period? A distraught Elizabeth, anxious that the French king might doubt her loyalty, may have written to Howard to reassure King Louis XI of her steadfastness. Why this possibility has not been seriously considered so far becomes clear when we examine the text. Keeping in mind that, as previously mentioned, at least the words "in body" were later inserted. Elizabeth thanked Norfolk for his many courtesies and friendly offices, and then she prayed him as before in the cause of to be a mediator for her, the marnage to the king, who, as she wrote, was her only Ioye and her maker in the world, and that she was his in heart, in thoughts, in body, and in all. And then she intimated that the better half of February was all paced, and that she feared the queen would newer die, and these be her written with her own hand own words, and this is the sum of her letter. If the letter were indeed from 1480 and related to the French marriage negotiations, the reference to the Queen's condition would make no sense. However, a fragment of what is believed to be Buck's original text, preserved despite a fire, does not include this detail. The fragment reads like this. Notably, there is no mention of the Queen's illness or Elizabeth fearing that she would never die. It is also unclear whether more than half of February had passed. Most importantly, no names have survived in this version to confirm whether the king referred to was Richard or Louis. Biographer Amy Licence has already suggested that the letter actually dates from 1480, and I believe this is correct. The letter does not concern Elizabeth's situation in 1485, but rather events 5 years earlier. A second important correction, proposed by Raitha Warnick, concerns Elizabeth's relationship with Margaret Beaufort. Contrary to the assumption that the two were rivals, Warnick argues convincingly that they were actually allies. Margaret, the mother of the future Henry VII, had served as a lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth Woodville, and the two women were known to be friends. A key historical example of their collaboration was their shared physician, Lewis Caerleon, who secretly transported messages between them in the summer of 1483. Elizabeth of York had also known Margaret for years, and there is no indication of any known conflict between them. While Margaret is often blamed for Elizabeth Woodville's later departure from court, a topic we will explore in episode 2, at this moment in time, the two women trusted each other enough to exchange messages that, if discovered, could have led to execution for high treason. Margaret was also in direct communication with her son Henry in Brittany. Given this existing network, Humphrey Brereton's claim that he smuggled letters between Elizabeth and Henry is not impossible. This is particularly plausible if Thomas Stanley was aware of it, or even approved. In December 1483, Richard III had rewarded Stanley for his support during the Buckingham Rebellion by appointing him Constable of England and transferring Margaret's estates to him. However, in March 1484, Richard made decisions that likely angered Stanley. He ruled that many of Margaret's properties would pass to his own loyal servants after Stanley's death, effectively ensuring that the Stanley family would not retain her lands. This move created a dangerous incentive for some of Richard's allies to hasten Stanley's demise. March 1484 also marked Elizabeth of York's arrival at Richard's court. A passage from Bessie's Song, a work of fiction, addresses this situation, portraying a conversation between Elizabeth and Stanley. In the song, she pleads for his help in restoring her rights, but Stanley initially refuses, citing his oath to Richard. When Elizabeth turns pale and collapses, Stanley reassures her. "Stand up, Lady Bessie. Now I see you do not feign. I will tell you that I have long thought of the matter as you do. But it is difficult to trust the secrecy of women, and many a man is brought to great woe by making them his confidants." Stanley then pledges his support, instructing his followers to rise at his command and encouraging Elizabeth to write letters expressing her intentions. This portion of the song likely contains a kernel of truth, suggesting that Stanley was willing to shield Elizabeth's letters rather than directly smuggling them himself. It is unlikely that a follower of Stanley would have written these lines without his knowledge and approval. We will explore later chapters to see that Elizabeth's letters were not only sent to Henry Tudor. Amy License even posits that Elizabeth may have acted as a spy for Henry and Margaret while at Richard's court. This same biographer also challenges the popular claim that Elizabeth wore an outfit identical to Queen Anne Neville's during Christmas 1483, something that was allegedly forbidden and interpreted as a public sign that Richard intended to replace Anne with Elizabeth. However, a more plausible explanation is that it was Anne who dressed like Elizabeth, not the other way around. At 10 years Elizabeth's senior, Anne treated her kindly. Agnes Strickland even describes their relationship as like a sisterhood. That Christmas marked Elizabeth's first without both her parents. Anne, who had experienced similar losses, her father as a child, sanctuary in a church asylum, the death of a sister, may have shown solidarity with Elizabeth rather than rivalry. This leads us to the lingering question of whether Richard truly intended to marry his niece. Elizabeth had lost her claim to the English throne through Titulus Regius, but her inheritance rights remained recognized in Spain and Portugal, regions with a vested interest in her marriage. If Richard sent her abroad, her future husband could claim Edward IV's legacy. To prevent this, Richard attempted to arrange a double marriage. He would wed a Portuguese princess to solidify his rule, but the Portuguese rejected the proposal. Richard was thus caught in a bind. Henry Tudor had publicly vowed to marry Elizabeth by Christmas 1483. To preempt this, Richard considered marrying her himself, not only to secure his legitimacy but also to produce heirs. A church dispensation could resolve the issue of consanguinity. Richard's decision to keep Elizabeth at court likely stemmed from concerns that her supporters might attempt to smuggle her out of England. Westminster Abbey, where her family had sought sanctuary in 1483, was closely guarded by his loyal followers, commanded by John Nesfield of Yorkshire. Ultimately, we do not know how serious Richard was about the marriage. According to chroniclers, his closest advisers, Catesby and Ratcliffe, strongly opposed it, not out of respect for Anne Neville's memory, but because they feared Elizabeth might seek revenge for the executions of her uncle, Anthony Woodville, and half-brother, Richard Grey. Ratcliffe himself had overseen their deaths. Even within Richard's inner circle, Elizabeth was perceived as more than a passive figure. According to Virgil, Rumours of the marriage reached Henry Tudor in Brittany, unsettling him. He knew that such an alliance would shatter his support. However, Richard soon publicly denied any intention to marry her. By this time, Elizabeth of York was 19. For much of her life, she had been destined to become Queen of France. When that future vanished, she remained a princess, until a man she barely knew, her uncle Richard, took everything from her. The lives of Elizabeth of York and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later King Richard III, rarely intersected before March 1484. When Elizabeth was born on February 11, 1466, Richard was in the north, residing at Middleham Castle under the care of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. When Warwick turned against Edward IV, Richard followed his brother into exile. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and her mother sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, where Edward V was born. For much of Elizabeth's early life, Richard remained in the north. According to historian Paul Murray Kendall, the Duke of Gloucester visited London only twice between 1478 and 1482. During the turmoil surrounding the princes in the Tower, Elizabeth was once again in Westminster Abbey with her family. In attempting to count the number of times Elizabeth and her uncle met before March 1484, I can confirm only 7 instances. The first was in 1468, when Elizabeth, at just 2 years old, bid farewell to her Aunt Margaret as she departed for Burgundy. Their next documented meeting occurred in 1471, when Edward IV and Richard returned triumphantly from exile. They met again in 1474, when Elizabeth's younger brother Richard was appointed Duke of York. The fourth encounter followed England's brief conflict with France, when Elizabeth's engagement to the future Charles VIII was secured. 3 years later, they saw each other at the wedding of Richard of Shrewsbury and Anne Mowbray. In 1480, Margaret of Burgundy visited England, marking the longest continuous period, 2 weeks, that uncle and niece ever spent together before 1484. Richard was also present in London for Christmas, 1482. Thus, on average, Elizabeth and Richard saw each other less than once every 2 years. When they did meet, their time together was brief, and Richard was typically occupied with official matters, where Elizabeth was not a central focus. One of Elizabeth's earliest formative experiences was the first time she and her family sought sanctuary in 1470. Forced to flee under the cover of darkness, they barely reached Westminster Abbey before the advancing Lancastrian forces took control of London. Within 2 days, the Tower of London had surrendered. For 5-year-old Elizabeth, this was a moment of profound upheaval. As Edward IV's eldest daughter, she had once been a potential heir, especially after George, Duke of Clarence, defected and her father and uncle fled the country. Now, she was a refugee. Her father was in grave danger, and her pregnant mother was forced to give birth in perilous conditions. It was the mentally unstable Henry VI who ultimately ensured Elizabeth Woodville receive medical care. Meanwhile, the forces that pursued them were men from the north, men her mother feared. Following this traumatic event, Elizabeth's fortunes seemed to rise. She was betrothed to the heir of France, and with the birth of her brothers, the burden of being a potential heir was lifted. She had been raised as the future Queen of France, surrounded by luxury. A passage from a contemporary parenting guide provides insight into how she was treated. When the princess wakes up in the morning, lying luxuriously in her bed between soft sheets, surrounded by rich accoutrements and everything for bodily comfort and ladies-in-waiting around her, focusing all their attention on her, and seeing that she lacks for nothing, ready to run to her if she gives the least sigh, to obey all her commands. Edward IV spared no expense in his daughter's upbringing. His financial records show that he spent £125 on an ornamental decoration for her at birth. Elizabeth was accustomed to celebrating Christmas with 2,000 guests, playing a central role as the fiancée of the French heir. Elizabeth's identity was built upon 3 pillars. She was Edward IV's eldest child, she was the future Queen of France, and she was the leader among her siblings. But starting in 1480, everything unraveled. First, her betrothal to the French heir was broken. Then, in 1482, her beloved sister Mary died. A year later, her father died suddenly. Soon after, her uncle Richard took control of the kingdom, forcing her into sanctuary once more. He then declared that her parents' marriage had been invalid, rendering her and her siblings illegitimate. This accusation struck Elizabeth with particular force. Richard's claim rested on an alleged pre-contract between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler, who had died in 1468. If such a contract had been binding until one of the partners, Dian, Elizabeth, born before Butler's death, would have been the only child permanently tainted by illegitimacy. Whether or not Richard was responsible for the deaths of the princes in the Tower, Elizabeth likely saw him as the man who had destroyed her world. Her maternal uncle, Anthony, Earl Rivers, and her half-brother, Richard Grey, had already been executed on Richard's orders. He had also had William Hastings, her father's closest ally, put to death. Elizabeth, as the eldest child, understood these horrors with full clarity. She was allegedly present when her mother collapsed in despair upon reaching sanctuary. Richard accused Elizabeth Woodville of witchcraft, the same charge once leveled against her grandmother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. By branding her mother a witch, Richard also labeled Elizabeth the illegitimate daughter of one. Then came the final humiliation. Richard forced Elizabeth out of sanctuary and into his court. He promised to find husbands for her and her sisters, but arranged a marriage only for Cecily. Soon, rumors spread that Richard intended to marry Elizabeth himself. Given all she had endured, it is far more plausible that Elizabeth willingly conspired with her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and Margaret Beaufort to overthrow her uncle rather than entertain the idea of marrying him. Yorkist supporters who had once been loyal to Edward IV and Edward V began to consider replacing Richard with Elizabeth. Though they had to accept Henry Tudor as part of the bargain, they made it clear from the start that Elizabeth of York would share the throne. This was the foundation of the alliance between the Woodvilles and the Tudors. Elizabeth herself actively contributed to the effort to remove Richard from power. The fact that Richard had to die in the process likely did not trouble her, especially considering his role in the execution of her family members and the nightmarish fear he had instilled in those living under his rule. Henry Tudor was the man who would restore her position, her legitimacy, and her future. For Elizabeth, he was not just a political ally. He was the key to reclaiming everything she had lost. Much has been written and speculated about the Buckingham Rebellion, with various theories attributing its leadership to John Morton, the Woodvilles, or Margaret Beaufort. In reality, Buckingham appears to have been more of a unifying figure than the true mastermind. However, there are reasons to challenge this view. For instance, it was Buckingham who insisted that Henry Tudor agree to marry Elizabeth of York before he would lend his support. Ultimately, John Morton accepted this condition on Tudor's behalf. Despite this, Elizabeth is often regarded as a mere symbolic figure in discussions about the rebellion. Charles Ross, in his biography of Richard III, has already demonstrated that this interpretation is incorrect. The earliest uprisings in Surrey and Sussex, according to Ross, were led primarily by essentially Edward IV's former household servants. However, they were not the only ones. Some rebels had ties to the households of the princes in the Tower, while many others were directly connected to Elizabeth herself. We know that coordination took place between those in Sanctuary, Margaret Beaufort and Buckingham in planning the rebellion. A key figure in this effort was Thomas Grey, who had fled Westminster Abbey. By late summer 1483, he had joined Buckingham, but he had already escaped Sanctuary as early as June. During that time, he reportedly sought refuge in Jane Shore's house, though it is likely he also acted as a messenger, passing on information. There may even have been letters from Elizabeth of York to her supporters. With her father dead and her brothers missing, Elizabeth was, by the understanding of the time, an adult, and, to Yorkists opposed to Richard, the rightful heir of Edward IV. It seems almost inevitable that she reassured her followers of her role and encouraged their participation in the uprising. The extent of the rebels' communication is evident in an unexpected turn of events. Richard III learned of the plan to marry Elizabeth to Henry Tudor even before the rebellion began, yet he chose not to publicize it, likely fearing that such news would only strengthen his opponents. Ultimately, the rebellion failed. However, it succeeded in at least one critical way. It publicly undermined Richard's claim to be the sole legitimate heir of his brother. Many rebels whom Richard later sought to pardon struggled to accept his clemency because doing so required recognizing him as king. Two notable examples were Sir Walter Hungerford and Sir Thomas Bourchier, both of whom would rise against Richard again on the eve of Bosworth. It is likely that their allegiance lay with the person they saw as Edward IV's true heir, his daughter, Elizabeth. This was yet another reason why Richard could not afford to lose control over her, and why she had to be removed from sanctuary. This adds another layer of significance to the proposed marriage. Richard's rise to power had fractured the House of York. The only way to reunite it was for the supporters of Edward IV and Edward V, who now saw Elizabeth as their rightful leader, to be persuaded to follow Richard instead. To achieve that, he had to make her queen, just as Henry Tudor intended to do. A source from 1490 offers a glimpse of Elizabeth as an active political figure. She personally nominated several individuals as justices in heir for part of her estates, and Henry followed her recommendations. This was not merely a case of Elizabeth being handed a predetermined list of names with the expectation that she approved them. The final two names on the list, Thomas Saul and John Stanford, prove otherwise. These men had no known ties to the Tudors, but had been involved in minor projects under Edward IV. Elizabeth must have been familiar with them personally. One of her nominees, Reynold Bray, was a servant of Margaret Beaufort, and had been accused of participating in the Buckingham Rebellion. He was presumably pardoned by Richard, likely under the protection of Stanley. Interestingly, the source in question refers to a Reginald Bray, but this is almost certainly a simple clerical error. However, the two most striking names on Elizabeth's list are Richard Empson and Edmund Chatterton. Empson had served on a commission under Richard III, tasked with defending the kingdom against Henry Tudor. He would later rise to become Lord Chancellor under Henry, emerging as a key figure in early Tudor England. Notably, it was Elizabeth who first nominated him for office. Even more remarkable is the case of Edmund Chatterton. He had been one of Richard's personal counselors and chaplain, receiving a number of prestigious appointments from him. Under Richard, he had even served as treasurer. By 1490, Elizabeth clearly knew and trusted individuals who had played significant roles in Richard's government, so much so that she recommended them for positions on her own estates. In Empson's case, Henry went even further, elevating him to a central role in his administration. At a time when Margaret of Burgundy, with the support of Lambert Simnel, had already made an attempt to restore the House of York and overthrow the Tudors. The fact that Henry and Elizabeth had such confidence in these men is striking. There are few explanations for this certainty. In reality, only one makes sense. Chatterton and Empson had likely been passing information to Elizabeth. In other words, they had been her spies within Richard's court. If Elizabeth, and possibly Stanley, had informants within Richard's administration, his reign may have been far more compromised than he ever realized. He seemed to sense the extent of his vulnerability, as he increasingly relied on promoting only men from the north, whom he had known for years. According to multiple accounts, Richard cried out, "Treason, treason," at the Battle of Bosworth when Stanley finally sided with Tudor. Perhaps in that moment, he realized just how many forces had been working against him all along. Elizabeth's importance to Henry Tudor and his mother was evident as early as Christmas 1483. Only after he swore an oath to marry the princess did the other exiles begin to treat him as their king. What remained of the House of Lancaster after Edward IV's reign was almost nothing. Even in 1470, an alliance with Richard Neville had been essential to their survival. 13 years later, the situation was even more dire. Without Yorkist support, Henry had no chance of claiming the throne. By seizing the crown, Richard III had fractured his own house, paving the way for his downfall. However, the Yorkists who aligned themselves with Tudor remained highly aware that their leader was not a Yorkist himself. The most striking example of this tension was Thomas Grey, who was so eager to return to England that he had to be physically prevented from doing so after his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, called him back. Several prominent names among those who fought for Henry at the Battle of Bosworth further illustrate this dynamic. Sir John Savage, nephew of Lord Stanley, had fought for Edward IV at Barnet and Tewkesbury. By royal command, he had also accompanied Richard to Scotland in 1482, where he was knighted by the Duke of Gloucester. However, Richard III distrusted him due to his family ties to Stanley, which ultimately led to Savage becoming one of the men who invited Tudor to invade England in 1485. Welshman Rhys ap Thomas was so trusted by Elizabeth Woodville that she allowed him to receive her letters, which were delivered to him by Lewis Caerleon. Meanwhile, Sir William Stanley, a lifelong Yorkist, had remained loyal to Edward IV over Richard. His allegiance to Elizabeth of York was unwavering, at least until he later placed his support behind Perkin Warbeck, believing him to be one of Edward's lost sons. Many of the men who fought under Henry Tudor on August 22nd were not there for him personally, but for the House of York, believing Elizabeth to be its rightful heir. After securing the throne, Henry justified his rule on the basis of right of conquest, but he wasted no time in summoning Elizabeth to join him. There are claims that Margaret Beaufort attempted to reconsider the marriage between her son and the princess, but the evidence for this is weak. In December 1485, Parliament officially urged Henry to honor his oath, though this was likely unnecessary. The couple was already waiting for a papal dispensation. The wedding ring had long since been ordered. Some suggest that Henry deliberately delayed the marriage, wishing to be crowned first. However, given that the couple required both papal approval and the repeal of Titulus Regius by Parliament, this interpretation does not hold up. In less than 5 months, Henry restored all of Elizabeth's rights and married her. Even Edward IV had once kept his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville a secret for a longer period of time. But where does Margaret of Burgundy fit into all this? We do not know her immediate reaction to her brother Richard's death. He was not her favorite sibling, but she was fond of him. It was well known that her strongest affection was for George. For instance, when Richard and Edward were in exile in 1470, Margaret visited them but took special care to speak with her younger brother in private. She assured Richard that George would return to the family. Later, during her visit to England in 1480, she treated Richard kindly but showed a particular interest in their mother. Her relationship with Edward IV, however, was far from amicable. After Isabel Neville's death, Margaret had advocated for George to marry her stepdaughter, Mary of Burgundy. Edward forbade the match, which deeply disappointed her. As history would show, their relationship deteriorated even further. Edward ultimately had her favorite brother executed in 1478. Among the high nobility, it was almost customary to blame the Woodvilles for every unpopular decision made by Edward IV. Margaret, deeply religious like her mother Cecily, was no exception. In her eyes, it was the Woodvilles who had murdered her brother. She may not have liked that Richard benefited greatly from George's death, but her resentment remained focused on both Woodvilles. This brings us back to the accusations of witchcraft. Margaret, like all her siblings, had a strong sense of status. The only explanation she likely found acceptable for how the Woodvilles, whom she viewed as beneath her family, could manipulate Edward and even triumph over Richard was the one Richard himself had given. Unchristian forces were at work on the Woodvilles' side. To Margaret, Elizabeth of York was the daughter of a witch, and possibly the granddaughter of one. She was also a bastard with no rightful claim to the English throne. The same, in Margaret's eyes, applied to Elizabeth's children. Determined to act, Margaret saw it as her duty, not just for her family but for England itself. The descendants of this illegitimate and unchristian line could not be allowed to remain on the throne. Intervention was necessary, but we'll explore that in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help my channel.